Jake Morrison had always been a man who preferred the company of horses to people. At 28, he was considered one of the finest wranglers in 3 counties. With calloused hands that could gentle the wildest mustang, and a reputation for keeping his word. His weathered face bore the marks of countless days under the scorching sun, and his quiet demeanor made him popular among the ranchers who valued hard work over fancy talk. The trouble started during the autumn cattle drive of 1887, when old Samuel Hartwell approached him with what the townspeople would later call the proposition. Samuel owned the largest spread in the territory, and his word carried weight in every saloon, general store, and church pew from here to the county seat. When Samuel Hartwell spoke, folks listened. And when he made suggestions about how things ought to be done, those suggestions had a way of becoming reality. "Jake, boy," Samuel had said, settling his considerable bulk onto a fence post while Jake worked with a particularly stubborn colt. "You've been riding alone too long. A man your age ought to be thinking about settling down, maybe starting a family." Jake had continued his work, not looking up from the rope in his hands. He'd heard this speech before from various well-meaning folks around town. At 28, he was indeed considered past the prime marrying age by local standards. But Jake had never felt the need for companionship beyond his horses and the occasional friendly conversation with fellow cowboys. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Hartwell, but I'm doing just fine on my own," Jake had replied, his voice steady and respectful but firm. Samuel's laugh was hearty but carried an undertone that made Jake's shoulders tense. "That's where you're wrong, son. See, I've been talking with some of the other folks around here, and we've all agreed that it's time you took yourself a wife. And we've got just the girl in mind." The way Samuel said, "We've all agreed," sent a chill down Jake's spine. In small frontier communities, when the influential men decided something was for the best, opposition became mighty difficult. These were the same men who controlled the jobs, the credit at the general store, and the social standing that could make life either comfortable or nearly impossible. "Now, I know what you're thinking," Samuel continued, waving off Jake's attempt to speak. "You're wondering about some young beauty. Maybe thinking about that Peterson girl, or one of the fancy ladies who come through on the stage. But we're talking about someone more practical. Someone who'd make a good, steady wife for a working man." Jake finally stopped his work and faced the older man fully. "Who exactly are you talking about, Mr. Hartwell?" "Mary Catherine Wilson," Samuel announced, with the satisfaction of a man solving a complex problem. Old Pete Wilson's daughter. Jake knew Mary Catherine by reputation more than personal acquaintance. She was 31, which made her practically an old maid by the harsh standards of frontier society. Folks around town had taken to calling her Plain Jane behind her back, though never where her father might hear. Pete Wilson ran a small but successful farm on the outskirts of town, and his daughter had the reputation of being bookish, outspoken, and entirely too independent for most men's tastes. "She's a bit older than most brides," Samuel acknowledged, "and she's got some peculiar notions about things. But she's healthy. She can cook and sew, and she's proven she can manage a household. Her father's getting on in years, and he needs someone to take over the farm eventually. You marry Mary Catherine, and you'd have yourself a nice piece of land to call your own." The arrangement began to make sense to Jake, though not in a way that pleased him. Pete Wilson needed security for his daughter and his land. The town elders wanted to see both Jake and Mary Catherine settled before they became even more of what they considered problems. Jake represented a good worker who was getting too independent, while Mary Catherine represented a woman who was getting too old and too opinionated to remain unmarried without reflecting poorly on the community's ability to manage its own affairs. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself under increasing pressure from every direction. The banker mentioned how nice it would be to see him with a steady home address when Jake came in to deposit his wages. The preacher spoke meaningfully about the biblical importance of marriage during Sunday services, his eyes finding Jake in the congregation with uncomfortable frequency. Even the other cowboys began making jokes about confirmed bachelors and suggesting that maybe it was time Jake thought about something other than horses. The pressure wasn't openly hostile, but it was relentless and pervasive. Jake began to understand that refusing the match wouldn't just be declining a marriage proposal. It would be rejecting the community's collective wisdom and authority. In a place where cooperation and conformity often meant the difference between prosperity and hardship, such rejection came with serious consequences. Mary Catherine, meanwhile, seemed to be enduring similar pressure from her own circles. Jake occasionally saw her in town, usually accompanied by other women who spoke to her in the encouraging but firm tones people used when trying to convince someone to accept something unpleasant but necessary. She carried herself with dignity, but Jake noticed the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept her conversations brief and formal. The first time Jake and Mary Catherine were officially introduced was at a community gathering organized specifically for that purpose. Mrs. Hartwell had arranged a Sunday dinner that included both families, along with several other prominent couples who could serve as witnesses to the proceedings. The meal was elaborate by local standards, with multiple courses and the good china that usually only appeared for Christmas and Easter. Jake found Mary Catherine to be exactly as advertised. Plain but not unattractive. Intelligent but in a way that seemed to make the other women uncomfortable, and possessed of a direct manner of speaking that contrasted sharply with the demure deference expected from unmarried women. When asked about her interests, she spoke knowledgeably about farming techniques and bookkeeping, rather than needlework and cooking. When the conversation turned to children, she expressed practical concerns about education and medical care, rather than romantic notions about motherhood. Throughout the dinner, Jake watched Mary Catherine navigate the expectations and pressures with a skill that suggested long practice. She was polite, without being subservient, agreeable without being enthusiastic, and careful to give offense to no one, while also making no commitments. It was a delicate performance, and Jake found himself grudgingly impressed by her composure under what he knew must be considerable strain. After the meal, when the women gathered in the parlor and the men retreated to the porch for cigars and whiskey, the conversation became more direct. Samuel laid out the practical benefits of the match with the precision of a businessman closing a deal. Jake would gain access to good farmland and a stable home. Mary Catherine would have security and social standing. Both families would benefit from the alliance, and the community would have one fewer unmarried woman and one fewer bachelor to worry about. Of course, Samuel concluded, we wouldn't want to rush anything, but a spring wedding would be appropriate. Don't you think? Give you both time to get acquainted proper. Jake realized he was being presented with a decision that wasn't really a decision at all. The community had made up its mind, and his role was simply to agree gracefully and make the best of the situation. Refusing would mean leaving town, giving up his reputation and his livelihood, and starting over somewhere else with nothing but his skills and his horse. That night, lying in his small cabin and staring at the ceiling, Jake tried to imagine what married life with Mary Catherine Wilson would be like. She seemed decent enough, and certainly more interesting than most people gave her credit for. But the thought of being maneuvered into marriage like a piece being moved on a checkerboard left him feeling trapped and resentful. What Jake didn't know, as he wrestled with his concerns in the darkness, was that Mary Catherine Wilson was lying awake in her own bed, staring at her own ceiling, and making plans that would surprise everyone who thought they knew exactly what kind of woman she was. The community might have decided that she was a problem to be solved through marriage, but Mary Catherine had some very different ideas about solutions. Mary Catherine Wilson had been listening to whispered conversations about her future for 3 months, and she'd heard enough. The morning of December 15th, 1887, she rose before dawn, dressed in her best traveling dress, and rode into town with a purpose that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew her. Her destination was the Silver Dollar Saloon, the most prominent gathering place for the men who had been arranging her life without her input. It was barely 9 in the morning, but the establishment was already open, serving coffee and breakfast to early risers and late-night drinkers who hadn't yet made it home. Mary Catherine tied her horse to the hitching post with steady hands, straightened her skirts, and walked through the swinging doors like she owned the place. The conversation stopped as if someone had fired a gunshot. Every head turned. Every eye fixed on the sight of a respectable unmarried woman entering a saloon in broad daylight. In the frontier society of 1887, such an action was scandalous beyond belief. Ladies simply did not enter drinking establishments, period. The fact that Mary Catherine was doing so with obvious intent, rather than by accident, made it even more shocking. Samuel Hartwell sat at his usual corner table with three other influential men, including the banker, the land office clerk, and Pete Wilson himself. Mary Catherine's father looked like he was about to have an apoplectic fit at the sight of his daughter in such a place. But before he could speak, Mary Catherine addressed the table in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "Gentlemen," she said, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "I understand you've been making plans concerning my future. I thought it might be appropriate for me to participate in the discussion." The bartender, a grizzled man named Murphy who had seen just about everything during his years in various frontier towns, stood frozen with a glass halfway to the shelf. The other patrons seemed equally paralyzed, unsure whether they should leave, stay, or intervene in whatever was about to happen. Samuel Hartwell recovered first, though his face had turned an interesting shade of red. "Miss Wilson, this is hardly the place for a lady. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable discussing this matter at your father's house, with the appropriate chaperones present." Mary Catherine smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Jake Morrison, who had been quietly eating his breakfast at the bar, pay very close attention. He had never seen Mary Catherine look quite so determined, and he realized he might have underestimated the woman the community was trying to pair him with. "Mr. Hartwell, since you and these other gentlemen have been conducting your discussions about my marriage in this establishment, I thought it only fitting that my response should be delivered here as well. After all, if this place is appropriate for planning my future, surely it's appropriate for me to respond to those plans." Pete Wilson found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Mary Catherine, you get yourself out of here this instant. This is no place for a woman," Mary Catherine interrupted, her voice remaining calm and pleasant despite the revolutionary nature of her words. "Papa, these gentlemen have been deciding what's best for women without consulting any women. I thought it might be educational for them to hear a female perspective on the matter." She turned back to Samuel Hartwell, her hands clasped primly in front of her, as if she were discussing the weather, instead of challenging the entire social order of the community. "I understand that you've decided, Mr. Morrison and I should marry in the spring. I also understand that this decision was made primarily for the convenience of everyone except Mr. Morrison and myself." Jake set down his coffee cup carefully, realizing that he was about to witness something unprecedented. Mary Catherine Wilson, the supposedly meek and plain spinster whom the town fathers thought they could manipulate like a chess piece, was about to demonstrate exactly how wrong they were about her character. "Now, I want to make something clear," Mary Catherine continued, her voice carrying easily through the silent saloon. "I have no particular objection to Mr. Morrison. He seems like a decent man, and I'm sure he would make someone a fine husband. However, I do object to being treated like livestock, to be traded for the convenience of others." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the wind rattling the windows. Mary Catherine let it stretch for a moment before continuing. "Therefore, I have a counter-proposal. If this community believes so strongly in the institution of marriage as a solution to social problems, then perhaps we should embrace that belief fully. Mr. Hartwell, you have 3 unmarried daughters of your own, all of whom are considerably younger and prettier than I am. Surely one of them would be a more suitable match for Mr. Morrison." Samuel's face went from red to purple. "That's entirely different. My daughters are desirable?" Mary Catherine suggested helpfully. "Yes, I'm sure they are. Which raises the question of why you're so eager to marry off the undesirable women like myself. Could it be that this arrangement is less about making good matches and more about disposing of inconvenient people?" Jake found himself fighting back a grin despite the seriousness of the situation. Mary Catherine was systematically dismantling the arguments that had been used to justify the arranged marriage, and she was doing it with a logical precision that left her opponents scrambling for responses. "Furthermore," Mary Catherine continued, warming to her theme, "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my situation. You've all assumed that I desperately need marriage to provide for my future security. Allow me to correct that assumption." She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a leather portfolio, which she placed on the table in front of the astonished men. "These are the deeds to 3 properties I've purchased in the past 2 years. 2 are rental houses here in town, and the third is a commercial building in the county seat. I've also invested in 2 mining operations and a freight company. My annual income from these investments exceeds what most men in this town earn in 2 years. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Pete Wilson stared at his daughter as if she had sprouted wings and begun speaking in tongues. The other men at the table appeared equally stunned by this information, which completely undermined their assumptions about Mary Catherine's financial desperation. "But how did you—" Pete began, then trailed off, apparently unable to complete the question. "How did I manage such business dealings without anyone knowing?" Mary Catherine asked. "Simple. I conducted my affairs through lawyers in the county seat and used my inheritance from Grandmother Wilson, whom you all seem to forget, left me quite well provided for. I also invested the profits from selling vegetables and preserves, which apparently none of you realized were bringing in substantial income." Jake realized his mouth was hanging open and closed it with a snap. The woman who had been dismissed as a burden on the community was revealing herself to be more financially successful than many of the men who had presumed to manage her life. Mary Catherine wasn't finished. She turned her attention to the room at large, addressing not just the men at the table but every person in the saloon. "I want everyone here to understand something important. I am not a problem that needs to be solved through marriage. I am not a burden on my family or this community. I am a grown woman with my own resources, my own plans, and my own right to determine my future." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering what Jake would later recognize as the coup de grace of her performance. "Therefore, I hereby publicly declare that I will not be marrying Mr. Morrison or anyone else chosen for me by well-meaning busybodies. If Mr. Morrison wishes to court me properly, as an equal rather than as a charity case to be taken off the community's hands, he's welcome to try. But this arrangement, conducted over my head and without my consent, ends today." The silence that followed was profound. Mary Catherine carefully gathered her papers, returned them to her portfolio, and pulled her gloves back on with the same deliberate precision she had used to remove them. As she prepared to leave, she delivered one final statement that would be repeated and discussed for months to come. "Gentlemen, you've spent considerable effort trying to solve problems that don't exist. Perhaps you might consider applying that energy to problems that actually do exist, like the failing bridge over Cedar Creek, or the fact that our schoolhouse hasn't had proper books in 3 years. Good day to you all." With that, Mary Catherine Wilson turned and walked out of the Silver Dollar Saloon with her head held high, leaving behind a room full of men who were beginning to realize that they had seriously underestimated the woman they had dismissed as Plain Jane. The sound of her horse's hooves as she rode away seemed to echo with the finality of everything that had just changed in their small community. News of Mary Catherine Wilson's saloon declaration spread across the territory like wildfire in dry grass. Within a week, riders carried the story to homesteads and ranches, 50 miles in every direction, and the tale grew with each telling. By Christmas, Mary Catherine had become a legend discussed in parlors, general stores, and around campfires throughout 3 counties. The immediate aftermath in town was chaotic. Samuel Hartwell found himself in the unprecedented position of having his authority publicly challenged by a woman, and his response revealed just how unaccustomed he was to such defiance. He spent the better part of a week attempting to organize a boycott of Mary Catherine's businesses, only to discover that most people were either too curious about her investments to avoid them, or too dependent on her rental properties to risk eviction. Pete Wilson, meanwhile, was forced to confront the reality that his daughter had been conducting successful business affairs under his own roof, without his knowledge. The discovery that Mary Catherine's financial acumen exceeded his own was particularly difficult for a man who prided himself on his practical wisdom. Their first conversation after the saloon incident was reportedly heard by neighbors 3 houses away, though Mary Catherine's voice never rose above its usual calm tone while her father's reached volumes that startled livestock. The most unexpected consequence of Mary Catherine's declaration came from an entirely unexpected source: the women of the community. Within days of the saloon incident, wives began asking pointed questions about family finances. Unmarried women started inquiring about business opportunities, and mothers began reconsidering what they taught their daughters about independence and propriety. Mrs. Emily Patterson, whose husband owned the lumber mill, was the first to follow Mary Catherine's example in a smaller but significant way. She announced at the next church social that she would be taking over the bookkeeping for the mill, having discovered several discrepancies that suggested her husband's mathematical skills were less reliable than previously assumed. When Mr. Patterson objected, his wife pointed out that if Mary Catherine Wilson could manage multiple business ventures, surely she could handle the accounts for a single lumber operation. The effect spread beyond individual households. The Women's Auxiliary, previously focused on organizing church socials and charity drives, suddenly developed an interest in community improvement projects. They began asking uncomfortable questions about the town budget, the condition of public facilities, and why certain problems that affected daily life had been ignored, while the men spent their time arranging marriages and discussing politics. Jake Morrison found himself in an equally complicated position. The collapse of the arranged marriage had freed him from an unwanted obligation, but it had also made him the center of unwelcome attention. Some people viewed him as a victim of Mary Catherine's selfishness, while others suggested he had been fortunate to escape marriage to such an obviously difficult woman. The most uncomfortable conversations came from those who wondered why he hadn't spoken up for himself during the arrangement process. 2 weeks after the saloon incident, Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He rode out to the Wilson farm and asked to speak with Mary Catherine privately. Pete Wilson grudgingly allowed the conversation, though he insisted it take place on the front porch, where he could observe from the kitchen window. "Miss Wilson," Jake began, hat in hand, and feeling more nervous than he had since his first day working with wild horses. "I wanted to apologize for my part in that whole business. I should have spoken up sooner about the arrangement. It wasn't right, what they were trying to do to both of us." Mary Catherine studied him with the same direct gaze that had made the town fathers so uncomfortable. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your apology, but you were under the same pressure I was. They made it very difficult to refuse without serious consequences." "Still," Jake persisted, "I should have found a way to handle it better. And I wanted you to know that what you did in the saloon took real courage. I've never seen anyone stand up to Samuel Hartwell like that." For the first time since he'd known her, Mary Catherine smiled without reservation. "Thank you. That means more than you might realize." They talked for nearly an hour, discovering that they had more in common than either had expected. Both valued independence and hard work. Both had been frustrated by the community's assumption that they needed guidance in managing their own lives. And both shared a dry sense of humor about the absurdity of their situation. When Jake finally rode away, he carried with him the beginning of what would become a genuine friendship. The broader impact of Mary Catherine's actions continued to reverberate throughout the winter and spring. 3 other arranged marriages that had been in various stages of planning quietly dissolved as the participants found the courage to voice their own objections. The unmarried Hartwell daughters, rather than being grateful for their father's protection from unwanted arrangements, began expressing opinions about their own romantic futures that left their father increasingly bewildered. By spring, the balance of power in the community had shifted in subtle but significant ways. The Women's Auxiliary had successfully lobbied for repairs to the schoolhouse and improvements to the main road. 2 other women had started their own small businesses, inspired by Mary Catherine's example. The town council found itself forced to actually address some of the practical problems they had previously ignored, as the women had become inconveniently persistent about getting results. Samuel Hartwell's influence remained strong, but it was no longer absolute. People had seen that his judgment could be questioned, his arrangements could be refused, and his authority was not divinely ordained. The realization had made the entire community more democratic and, grudgingly, more honest about addressing real problems rather than inventing solutions for imaginary ones. The most significant long-term change, however, was in how young people viewed their futures. Daughters began asking their parents about education beyond basic literacy. Sons questioned whether they had to follow their father's career paths, and both boys and girls started imagining possibilities that extended beyond the traditional roles their parents had assumed were inevitable. Mary Catherine herself seemed to thrive in her newfound notoriety. Her business ventures continued to prosper, and she began investing in improvements that benefited the entire community. She funded the new school books that the town council had been debating for years, contributed to the bridge repairs, and quietly provided loans to help other women start small businesses. Her actions gradually shifted her reputation from difficult spinster to community leader. Though she never sought public recognition for her contributions, the relationship between Mary Catherine and Jake evolved slowly but steadily throughout the spring and summer. What began as mutual respect developed into genuine affection, based on equality and choice rather than convenience and pressure. When Jake finally proposed marriage in August of 1888, it was after months of proper courtship, and with the full knowledge that he was asking to join his life with that of an independent, successful woman who could have easily refused. Their wedding, when it finally took place in September, was attended by people from homesteads and ranches across 4 counties. Many came out of curiosity to see the woman who had become a legend, but they stayed to witness a ceremony that represented something new in their frontier society. A marriage based on partnership between equals rather than an arrangement between families. The story of Mary Catherine Wilson's bold response to the community's matchmaking efforts became one of those tales that fathers told sons and mothers told daughters for generations. It served as a reminder that even in a society that valued conformity and tradition, individuals could still choose their own paths if they had sufficient courage and determination. More importantly, it demonstrated that sometimes the people dismissed as problems by their communities are actually solutions waiting to be recognized. Mary Catherine's financial success, business acumen, and community contributions had always existed, but they had been invisible to people who couldn't see past their own assumptions about what women could and should accomplish. Years later, when other frontier communities faced similar situations, people would say, "Remember what happened when they tried to arrange that marriage for plain Jane Wilson." The story became a cautionary tale for those who presumed to manage other people's lives without their consent, and an inspiration for those who felt trapped by others' expectations. Mary Catherine and Jake's marriage proved to be both happy and prosperous, marked by mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and the kind of partnership that comes when 2 independent people choose to build a life together, rather than being forced into an arrangement by outside pressure. Their success became another part of the legend, proving that marriages based on choice and equality could thrive in ways that arranged unions often could not. The community that had once tried to solve its problems by marrying off inconvenient people learned to approach such issues with more wisdom and less presumption. And every time someone suggested that a particular woman or man needed to be settled down through marriage, someone else would invariably mention Mary Catherine Wilson and the day she walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon to reclaim control of her own destiny.